Why do the most powerful countries in the world avoid fighting each other directly? The United States, Russia, China, these countries have strong militaries, advanced technology, and influence across the globe. They play major roles in global decisions, security, economics, and diplomacy. Yet when tensions rise between them, they almost always stop short of direct conflict. Why does this happen? Erratad. This question often surprises people, because power usually suggests strength, and strength suggests action, But in global politics, power works differently. For superpowers, every decision is connected to consequences far beyond their own borders. Here is an important idea to understand. Superpowers do not avoid conflict because they are weak. They avoid direct conflict because the cost of losing control is too high. When powerful nations interact, even small actions can create large reactions. A statement, a movement, a misunderstanding, things can escalate faster than expected. This is why decisions at the highest level are made very carefully. Leaders consult experts, military planners, economic advisors. They do not ask, can we act? They ask, what happens after we act? Unlike smaller conflicts, a direct clash between superpowers would affect the entire world. Trade routes, energy supplies, financial markets, millions of people far from the conflict would feel the impact. This global responsibility, create hesitation. So instead of direct confrontation, superpowers rely on pressure, diplomatic signals, strategic messages, military readiness displays. These actions communicate intent without crossing dangerous boundaries. To truly understand why these limits exist, we must look at the factor that changed global strategy forever. A factor that reshaped how power is used, nuclear capability. A major turning point in global politics was the arrival of advanced strategic weapons. These developments changed how powerful countries think about confrontation. Before this era, conflicts were limited and outcomes were clearer. Country could calculate risks and manage consequences. But modern strategic capabilities made those calculations far more complex. Today, Mike, major powers possess technologies that can create large-scale global impact. This reality introduced a new kind of thinking. If one powerful country takes an extreme step, the response would not stay limited. It would expand quickly and affect far more than just two nations. Cry like I cried. Because of this, the idea of winning lost its meaning. Even the side that remains standing would face serious long-term challenges, economic systems, urban development, public stability, everything would be under pressure. In Ranger, this led to a concept known as strategic deterrence. In simple terms, it means avoiding extreme actions because the response would be equally severe. The goal is not to use power, but to prevent situations where power must be used. This thinking became especially important during the Cold War period. Two major global rivals competed for influence, technology, and leadership. Trust was low, tensions were high. Yet they avoided direct confrontation. There were moments when the situation became very serious. Decisions were taken carefully. Communication channels remained open, because leaders understood that misunderstandings could create outcomes no one intended. These moments taught an important lesson. Direct confrontation between major powers does not bring stability. It creates uncertainty. for the entire world. That lesson remains relevant today, right? When modern tensions rise, leaders remember these experiences. They remember how close the world once came to uncontrollable situations and why restraint mattered. Strategic deterrence is not about fear. It is about responsibility. A shared understanding that some actions carry consequences too large to manage. When powerful countries avoid direct confrontation, it does not mean competition disappears. Okay? Instead, it changes its shape. Okay? Superpowers continue to compete, but in indirect ways, this approach allows influence to expand without crossing dangerous limits. One common method is indirect involvement in regional conflicts. Rather than acting openly, powerful nations support different sides, through training, resources, and strategic guidance. This allows them to protect interests without direct engagement. Over the years, many regions have become areas where this indirect competition plays out, local issues combined with global interests. Different powers support different outcomes based on strategy, not emotion. Another reason this approach is preferred is control. Indirect involvement allows flexibility. Support can be increased, reduced, or adjusted. This makes it easier to manage outcomes and reduce unexpected escalation. Issues för avskaffa aspekter inför offerdi. Economic influence is also a key tool. Powerful countries use trade, sanctions, and investment. These methods apply pressure without open confrontation. They shape decisions quietly, but effectively, information has become another major space for competition. Narratives, media influence, public opinion, all are part of modern strategy. These methods can change perceptions without physical confrontation. Technology has expanded this further. Cyber operations, digital influence, economic systems, competition now happens across invisible networks. This form of rivalry is harder to detect, but very powerful. Because of these tools, direct confrontation becomes unnecessary. Superpowers can achieve goals without crossing red lines. This keeps competition ongoing, but contained. So when we see tension in the world today, it is often indirect, strategic, calculated, not accidental. This explains why global conflicts today look different from the past, less direct, more complex, and carefully managed. Another major factor that prevents direct conflict is alliances. No superpower acts completely alone. The United States has strategic partnerships. Russia maintains key alliances. China strengthens economic and regional ties. If one major power takes a direct step, allies may be involved. This makes escalation more likely and the stakes much higher. Global leaders understand this. Decisions are made carefully, considering not just their country, but the broader global impact. This creates a natural restraint. Modern competition also includes new areas, economic influence, cyber networks, information strategies. Country can achieve their goals without entering dangerous territory. These methods are strategic, mesmered, and controlled. Reiner goes, so when you see tensions rising today, military exercises, diplomatic negotiations, economic measures. Remember, these actions are part of a global balancing act. Superpowers are exercising caution not avoiding responsibility. Looking to the future, indirect competition will likely continue as technologies advance and global connections deepen. Superpowers will seek influence, but through controlled and calculated means. Direct confrontation remains highly unlikely. The risks are too great.